The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Pentagon Defense Intelligence Center as Elena Martinez settled into her workstation on the third floor. At 23, with gentle brown eyes and a soft voice that barely carried across the analysis department, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Her desk sat tucked in the back corner, surrounded by stacks of classified documents and multiple computer monitors displaying satellite feeds from across the globe to her supervisors. She was simply Analyst Martinez, employee number 4429, specializing in infrastructure assessment and pattern recognition. Nothing more, nothing less. Just another dedicated but unremarkable face in the crowd of intelligence professionals who kept America safe from the shadows. Director Klaus Weber barely acknowledged her presence during the morning briefing, his attention focused on the senior analysts who sat at the front of the room. These were the people who briefed generals, who shaped policy, who mattered when critical decisions needed to be made. Elena took notes in her precise handwriting, documenting not just the intelligence being discussed, but the subtle dynamics of power and dismissal that played out in every meeting. Her direct supervisor, Captain Laurent Davis, treated her with the patronizing kindness reserved for junior staff who posed no threat to advancement. "Martinez," he would say with that condescending smile, "your reports are always so thorough. Perfect for someone in your position." The unspoken message was crystal clear. Know your place, stay in your lane, and don't aspire beyond your designated role. What Captain Davis didn't know was that Elena had been privately conducting her own intelligence assessments for months. While officially tasked with monitoring civilian infrastructure, she had been tracking concerning patterns in military communications, identifying potential security breaches, and documenting irregularities that her superiors seemed determined to ignore or minimize. Her colleagues saw her dedication as admirable but excessive. Rebecca Thompson, the only other woman in their department, often commented on how Elena stayed late reviewing files that others considered routine. "You don't need to prove anything," Rebecca would tell her during their brief conversations in the break room. "You're already doing excellent work for someone at your level." Someone at your level. The phrase followed Elena everywhere, a constant reminder that 8 years of preparation had earned her nothing more than a reputation for being reliable and harmless. She had chosen this path deliberately, understanding that being underestimated was the greatest advantage she could possess. But some days, the weight of hiding her true capabilities felt almost unbearable. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days analyzing threats to American security, while being considered too junior to be included in actual threat assessment meetings. Her insights were filtered through supervisors who often missed the subtle connections she identified. Her recommendations diluted or ignored entirely by people who had never spent time understanding the complex web of relationships that defined modern intelligence work. But Elena had learned patience from masters who understood that the most dangerous opponent was the one nobody saw coming. Every day she wasn't challenged was another day to observe, to learn, to prepare for the moment when her hidden strengths would finally matter. The calluses hidden beneath her long sleeves told a different story than her gentle demeanor suggested, earned from years of training that began before dawn and ended long after her official duties were complete. What her colleagues couldn't see was how her eyes tracked movement with predatory awareness, or how she positioned herself near exits with the unconscious habit of someone trained for combat. Most importantly, they never suspected that the quiet woman who organized their files had been systematically studying every security protocol, every weakness, every potential threat within their own organization. Elena Martinez had spent 8 years building 2 parallel identities. The visible one sat quietly in the corner, filed reports with meticulous precision, and accepted limitations with graceful submission. The hidden one possessed capabilities that would terrify the people who dismissed her daily, skills that had been forged in places where weakness meant death and hesitation meant failure. Soon, very soon, those two identities would collide in a way that would shock everyone who thought they knew her. But for now, she remained invisible, gathering intelligence and waiting for the moment when hiding would no longer be an option. The transformation had begun 8 years earlier, when Elena was 15 and her world had been shattered by tragedy. The transformation had begun when Elena was 15, standing in a military training facility where her older brother, Carlos, worked with a group of men who moved like shadows and spoke in whispers about operations that never made the news. These were former Army Special Forces soldiers, men who had served in conflicts that didn't officially exist, who understood that real strength came not from size or aggression, but from precision, timing, and absolute control. Carlos had brought her to the facility reluctantly, only after months of persistent requests and their mother's growing concern about Elena's increasingly withdrawn behavior following their father's death in Afghanistan. What he expected was for his sister to attend a few self-defense classes and gain some confidence. What he discovered was that Elena possessed a natural aptitude for combat that bordered on supernatural. Master Sergeant Ricardo Williams, the facility's owner and chief instructor, recognized her potential immediately. Where other students struggled to master basic techniques, Elena absorbed complex fighting systems with an intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught. Her small frame, initially seen as a disadvantage, became her greatest asset as she learned to use an opponent's size and strength against them. Size doesn't matter when you know where to strike, Master Sergeant Williams would tell her during their private sessions. The most dangerous warrior is the one who appears defenseless until the moment she chooses not to be. The training was unlike anything taught in conventional martial arts schools. These men had learned their skills in places where second place meant death, where technique mattered more than strength, where the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure determined who went home and who didn't. They taught her Krav Maga, Filipino martial arts, Russian combat systems, and combat psychology. More importantly, they taught her how to hide her capabilities behind a facade of normalcy. Elena threw herself into the training with an intensity that concerned even her instructors. She arrived before dawn and stayed until the facility closed, pushing her body and mind beyond normal limits. The physical training was brutal, designed to forge reactions that would work under life-threatening stress. But the psychological training was even more demanding, teaching her to maintain absolute emotional control while under extreme pressure. Your enemy's greatest weapon is your own fear, Williams explained during one particularly intense session. Master your fear, and you master your enemy. The other students were mostly young men preparing for military service or law enforcement careers. Elena was the only female, the youngest by several years, and initially the target of condescending attitudes from trainees who couldn't see past her appearance. That changed quickly as she began demonstrating abilities that exceeded most of their instructors. By the time Elena entered college to study international relations and intelligence analysis, she had already mastered fighting systems that most military personnel never encountered. She could disarm opponents twice her size, disable attackers with strikes to pressure points they didn't know existed, and maintain complete emotional control while under physical threat. But more importantly, she had learned to hide these abilities so completely that even her own family had no idea of her true capabilities. Her college years were spent building two parallel skill sets. Publicly, she excelled in her academic studies, earning top marks in strategic analysis, American security studies, and intelligence methodology. Her professor saw a dedicated student with exceptional analytical abilities and a keen understanding of geopolitical complexity. Her classmates knew her as friendly but reserved, someone who studied hard and kept to herself. Privately, She continued her combat training with Master Sergeant Williams's network of former Special Operations personnel. They had recognized something in her that went beyond physical ability, an absolutely calm center that remained unshakable under pressure, combined with an analytical mind that could process multiple variables simultaneously while engaged in physical conflict. The training evolved beyond simple combat techniques. They taught her to read body language and micro-expressions, to identify threats before they materialized, to assess the psychological profiles of potential adversaries. She learned to move through crowds unnoticed, to gather information without arousing suspicion, to project whatever persona the situation required. When she applied for her position at the Defense Intelligence Center, Elena presented herself as exactly what they expected: a young woman with excellent academic credentials and a methodical approach to analysis. Her interviewers saw someone who would be reliable, thorough, and content to work behind the scenes supporting more senior personnel. What they hired was someone who could have taken apart their entire security apparatus if she had chosen to do so. But Elena understood that real power came from being consistently underestimated, from maintaining the facade of harmlessness while continuously gathering information and refining her capabilities. During her 8 years at the center, she had studied every person who worked there, memorizing their habits, their weaknesses, their pressure points, both literal and psychological. She knew which security guards were actually alert and which ones were just going through the motions. She understood the building's layout better than the architects who designed it, including emergency exits, structural weaknesses, and blind spots in the surveillance system. Most importantly, she had been watching General Heinrich Kruger, preparing for the day when their paths would inevitably cross in a way that would reveal exactly who she really was. General Heinrich Kruger embodied everything wrong with the old guard of American military leadership. At 58, he commanded respect through intimidation rather than competence, wielding his authority like a weapon against anyone he perceived as beneath his station. His appointment to oversee defense intelligence coordination had been controversial, but his political connections and willingness to silence dissent had secured his position. Elena had been observing him for 3 years, ever since his arrival at the Defense Intelligence Center, where others saw a decorated general with an impressive service record. She saw a man whose career had been built on taking credit for subordinates' work, while systematically destroying anyone who threatened his authority. His treatment of junior staff, particularly women, revealed a character that relied on psychological intimidation to maintain control. The culture Kruger fostered was one of absolute hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. During briefings, he would openly mock analysts who presented findings that contradicted his preconceptions. Junior officers learned quickly that survival meant agreeing with whatever position the general had already decided to take, regardless of what the intelligence actually indicated. Elena watched him humiliate Captain Maria Rodriguez during a routine briefing about Russian troop movements. Rodriguez had prepared a thorough analysis suggesting that recent deployments were defensive rather than aggressive, contradicting Kruger's public statements about imminent threats. Instead of engaging with her analysis, Kruger had attacked her competence, her experience, and finally her gender, suggesting that perhaps intelligence work was too complex for someone who clearly didn't understand military strategy. The room had fallen silent as Rodriguez gathered her materials with shaking hands, her face flushed with humiliation. No one spoke in her defense. No one challenged Kruger's assessment. The message was clear. This was what happened to people who forgot their place in his hierarchy. But Elena also noticed something else during these encounters. Kruger's intimidation tactics followed predictable patterns. He relied heavily on his physical presence, using his size and position to tower over subordinates. His verbal attacks were designed to provoke emotional reactions that would justify further punishment. Most importantly, he seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting people he perceived as weak or defenseless. The general's treatment of women was especially revealing. He dismissed their contributions with casual sexism disguised as professional critique. Female analysts found their reports questioned more thoroughly, their recommendations ignored more. Frequently, their presence at important meetings mysteriously forgotten. When confronted about these patterns, Kruger would claim he was simply maintaining standards, suggesting that anyone who couldn't handle his leadership style wasn't suited for intelligence work. Dr. Amanda Peterson, a brilliant cybersecurity specialist, had been one of his most high-profile victims. Her research into Chinese cyber capabilities had been groundbreaking, earning recognition from intelligence agencies across the government. But when she presented findings that contradicted Kruger's assessment of a potential cyber attack, he had systematically undermined her credibility, questioning her methodology, her objectivity, and finally her loyalty to America. Within 6 months, Dr. Peterson had requested a transfer to a different department. Her departure was framed as a career advancement, but everyone understood what had really happened. Another brilliant analyst had been driven away rather than allowed to challenge Kruger's authority. The pattern extended beyond gender. Kruger seemed to have an instinctive ability to identify anyone who might pose a threat to his position and systematically destroy their credibility before they could challenge him. Younger analysts learned to keep their heads down and their insights to themselves. Innovation died in an atmosphere where being right mattered less than being subservient. Elena observed these dynamics with the detached precision of a predator studying its prey. She understood that Kruger's power came not from competence, but from his willingness to destroy anyone who revealed his limitations. His intimidation tactics worked because most people were unprepared for the psychological violence he employed to maintain control. But Elena also recognized something that others missed. Kruger's aggression was actually a weakness. Men who relied on intimidation had never learned to fight against opponents who couldn't be intimidated. His entire strategy depended on his targets being afraid of him, being emotionally reactive, being unprepared for his attacks. She began to understand that eventually, Kruger's need to dominate would lead him to target her directly. When that moment came, he would discover that his usual tactics were useless against someone who had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. The general's office was decorated with photographs of himself with various political figures and military leaders, creating a shrine to his own importance. Elena had been inside twice, both times to deliver reports that were subsequently credited to other analysts. She had used those opportunities to study the room's layout, identifying sightlines, potential weapons, and escape routes with the unconscious habits of someone trained for combat. Kruger's desk was positioned to force visitors to approach from a position of disadvantage, with their backs to the door and the general elevated above them. His chair was oversized, adding to his physical presence, while visitor chairs were deliberately uncomfortable and positioned to make people feel small and vulnerable. But Elena saw these displays differently than most visitors, where others saw intimidating symbols of authority. She saw the defensive mechanisms of someone who had never learned to lead through competence. Every aspect of Kruger's office was designed to compensate for insecurities that he couldn't acknowledge, even to himself. Soon, very soon, she would have the opportunity to show him what real strength looked like. While General Kruger built his empire of fear, Elena quietly demonstrated abilities that surpassed most of her senior colleagues. Her official assignments involved routine intelligence analysis, but her actual contributions went far beyond what appeared in her performance reviews. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify patterns in data that others missed. Connections that revealed threats before they materialized. The Nashville incident had been her first major breakthrough, though no one knew she was responsible for preventing a potential terrorist attack. Official records credited the successful interdiction to a joint operation between FBI and military intelligence. But the truth was more complex. Elena had identified suspicious financial transactions while reviewing routine economic data, recognizing patterns that suggested weapons procurement for an attack on a defense contractors conference. Her analysis had revealed a network of shell companies, encrypted communications, and logistical preparations that pointed to a coordinated assault planned for the conference's opening ceremony. But when she attempted to report her findings through official channels, her warnings were dismissed as speculation based on insufficient evidence. Captain Davis had actually laughed when she presented her analysis, suggesting that perhaps she was reading too much into coincidental data points. Frustrated but not deterred, Elena had taken an unprecedented step. Using contacts from her brother's network of former special operations personnel, she had passed her intelligence to federal authorities through unofficial channels, providing them with enough information to disrupt the plot while maintaining plausible deniability about the source. The operation had been a complete success. Federal agents had arrested 12 domestic terrorists, seized a cache of weapons and explosives, and uncovered plans for an attack that could have killed hundreds of defense industry leaders. The intelligence community celebrated the victory as an example of successful interagency cooperation, never knowing that a junior analyst they barely noticed had been responsible for saving countless lives. But rather than satisfaction, Elena felt the bitter irony of her situation. Her greatest professional achievement would never be officially recognized because she had been forced to work outside a system that refused to take her seriously. She had prevented a massacre while being told she wasn't qualified to analyze the very data that had revealed the threat. The pattern continued with smaller but equally significant contributions. She identified cyber vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure before they could be exploited, tracked money laundering operations that funded terrorist activities, and recognized surveillance patterns that indicated foreign intelligence operations against American targets. Each time, her warnings were either ignored or credited to more senior personnel after the threats materialized. Dr. James Anderson, the center's chief analyst, had built much of his recent reputation on insights that originated from Elena's work. He had a talent for taking her preliminary analyses, expanding them slightly, and presenting them as his own discoveries. The practice was subtle enough to avoid formal accusations of plagiarism, but systematic enough that Elena understood she was being deliberately marginalized while her ideas were being appropriated. The most frustrating aspect was watching senior analysts make fundamental errors that she could have prevented if her input had been valued. During a briefing about Iranian nuclear capabilities, she noticed inconsistencies in satellite imagery that suggested the intelligence was being deliberately manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Her attempts to raise these concerns were dismissed as nitpicking from someone who didn't understand the broader strategic picture. 6 months later, when the intelligence proved to be fabricated and led to a diplomatic crisis, the same people who had ignored her warnings expressed surprise at the deception. No one remembered that the junior analyst in the corner had tried to tell them something was wrong. Elena documented everything meticulously, building a private archive of her contributions and the system's failures to recognize them. She understood that someday this documentation might be crucial, not just for her own vindication, but for revealing the fundamental problems with an intelligence apparatus that valued hierarchy over accuracy. Her unofficial network continued to grow as well. Former special operations personnel, intelligence analysts from other agencies, and cybersecurity specialists who had worked with her brother all came to recognize her exceptional abilities. They began feeding her information and asking for her analysis on sensitive matters, creating a shadow intelligence network that operated parallel to official channels. These relationships gave her access to information that wasn't available through normal channels, allowing her to develop increasingly sophisticated analyses of emerging threats. She learned about Russian disinformation campaigns months before they appeared in official intelligence reports, identified Chinese cyber operations that official agencies missed entirely, and tracked terrorist financing networks with precision that exceeded anything being done through conventional intelligence gathering. But the more competent she proved herself to be through unofficial channels, the more invisible she became within the official system. Her superiors saw exactly what they expected to see: a reliable but unremarkable analyst who did excellent work within her limited scope of responsibility. Elena had learned to compartmentalize the frustration, channeling it into motivation for the intensive training sessions she maintained outside work hours. Master Sergeant Williams's facility had become her second home, a place where her capabilities were recognized and challenged rather than dismissed and ignored. "You're preparing for war," Williams observed during one particularly intense session. "The question is whether you'll recognize the battlefield when you encounter it." Elena understood what he meant. The real battle wouldn't be fought in some foreign conflict zone, but within the very institution she served. Her enemy wouldn't be a foreign adversary, but the willful ignorance and institutional arrogance that kept America vulnerable to threats that could be identified and prevented by someone with the skills to see them. The day was approaching when her patience would run out, when the system's failures would become too dangerous to tolerate, when hiding her capabilities would become a luxury she could no longer afford. When that day arrived, General Kruger and everyone else who had underestimated her would discover exactly what they had been dismissing for 8 years. The morning of March 15th began like any other, with routine intelligence briefings and the usual undercurrent of tension that characterized life under General Kruger's leadership. But by 10:30 in the morning, everything had changed. Reports began flooding in about a coordinated cyber attack targeting American financial infrastructure, causing widespread disruption across multiple states. Banking systems from New York to California were experiencing simultaneous failures. Stock exchanges were shutting down to prevent market crashes, and emergency services were struggling with communication blackouts. The attack's sophistication and coordination suggested state-level involvement, but initial assessments couldn't identify the source or predict the next phase of the assault. General Kruger convened an emergency response meeting, gathering senior analysts and Pentagon liaison officers in the center's primary briefing room. The atmosphere was tense as officials tried to understand the scope of the attack while coordinating responses across multiple agencies and departments. Real-time updates scrolled across wall-mounted monitors, painting a picture of escalating chaos throughout American financial networks. Elena watched from her workstation as the crisis unfolded, her analytical mind already processing patterns that others were missing. She recognized elements of the attack methodology from previous incidents she had studied, subtle signatures that suggested the involvement of a specific cyber-criminal organization with known ties to state sponsors. More importantly, she was beginning to see indications of what the next phase might involve. The attack wasn't random or opportunistic. The timing, targets, and methodology suggested a carefully planned operation designed to create maximum disruption while testing American response capabilities. But while her colleagues focused on damage assessment and immediate containment, Elena recognized that the financial attack was likely just the opening move in a larger campaign. Her analysis of the malware signatures and attack vectors revealed connections to previous operations that had targeted critical infrastructure in Eastern Europe. The same group had tested electrical grid vulnerabilities in Ukraine, water treatment systems in Estonia, and transportation networks in Poland. Each attack had been dismissed as isolated cybercrime, but Elena saw the pattern: systematic probing of allied infrastructure to identify weaknesses for a coordinated assault. She began pulling data from sources her colleagues didn't know existed, using her unofficial network to gather intelligence that wasn't available through normal channels. Former contacts in various agencies provided her with technical details about the attack methodology, while cybersecurity specialists shared analysis of the malware's unique characteristics. What she discovered was terrifying in its scope and sophistication. The financial attack was synchronized with preliminary probes against power grids, communication networks, and transportation systems across America. The attackers were conducting real-time reconnaissance, testing response times, and coordination between different agencies. They were learning how the American security apparatus functioned under stress, gathering information for what appeared to be a much larger operation. But when Elena attempted to share her analysis during the emergency briefing, she discovered that junior analysts weren't being included in the crisis response. Captain Davis informed her that her role was to continue monitoring routine intelligence while senior personnel handled the emergency. Her insights about the attack's broader implications were dismissed as speculation that went beyond her assigned responsibilities. She watched in growing frustration as senior analysts focused on immediate damage control while missing the strategic picture entirely. They were treating the attack as an isolated incident requiring technical solutions, when her analysis suggested it was actually intelligence gathering for a campaign that could paralyze American infrastructure for weeks. Dr. Anderson presented an assessment that attributed the attack to opportunistic cybercriminals seeking financial gain, recommending defensive measures that would protect against similar future incidents. His analysis was technically competent but strategically myopic, focusing on symptoms rather than understanding the underlying threat. General Kruger accepted Anderson's assessment without question, ordering a response that prioritized public confidence over strategic preparation. The official Pentagon statement described the attack as criminal activity that was being aggressively pursued through law enforcement channels, completely missing its true significance as preliminary reconnaissance for a larger operation. Elena realized that the American intelligence community was about to be blindsided by an attack they weren't prepared for because they had fundamentally misunderstood what was happening. Her analysis suggested that the next phase would target physical infrastructure power grids, transportation networks, communication systems within 72 hours, coordinated to maximize disruption and prevent effective response. She faced a choice that would define her career and potentially determine the fate of American security infrastructure. She could remain silent, following protocols and accepting that her insights weren't valued by the system she served. Or she could find a way to ensure that her analysis reached people who could act on it, even if doing so meant going around the very authorities who had dismissed her warnings. The attack was still escalating, and time was running out. Elena looked around the operations center, watching brilliant people make catastrophic mistakes because they couldn't see past their own assumptions. For 8 years, she had accepted their limitations as the price of remaining hidden. But now their blindness threatened to cost lives on a scale that made personal considerations irrelevant. She made her decision, knowing that once she crossed this line, there would be no going back to the comfortable invisibility she had maintained for so long. By afternoon, the crisis had deepened beyond anything American intelligence agencies were prepared to handle. The initial financial cyber attack had evolved into something far more sophisticated and devastating than General Kruger's response team had anticipated. Banking systems remained offline across 6 states, causing panic among civilians who couldn't access their accounts or make basic transactions. Stock markets had suspended trading indefinitely, and emergency services were reporting communication failures that hampered their ability to coordinate responses. But the most alarming development was what Elena had predicted. Secondary attacks were beginning to materialize against critical infrastructure. Power grids in Texas and Florida were experiencing unexplained fluctuations. Water treatment facilities in California were reporting system malfunctions, and air traffic control systems across the Northeast were suffering intermittent failures that grounded commercial flights. General Kruger's crisis response strategy was proving catastrophically inadequate. His team continued to treat each incident as an isolated cybersecurity problem, deploying technical solutions that addressed symptoms while ignoring the coordinated nature of the assault. They were fighting the previous war, applying conventional cybersecurity protocols to an unprecedented campaign that required completely different thinking. The Pentagon Coordination Center had become a chaos of overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting priorities. Federal agencies were protecting their own assets while sharing minimal information with allies, creating gaps in the collective response that the attackers were exploiting with surgical precision. Military cybersecurity units were focused on protecting their own networks rather than coordinating defense of civilian infrastructure. Dr. Anderson's assessment had led to a response strategy that was not only ineffective but actively counterproductive. His recommendation to treat the attacks as criminal activity had resulted in law enforcement agencies taking the lead on what was actually a military-grade assault on American infrastructure. FBI investigators were conducting forensic analysis while power grids were being probed for vulnerabilities that could plunge entire regions into darkness. The failure of conventional approaches was becoming evident as real-time reports streamed into the crisis center. Technical countermeasures were being circumvented faster than they could be implemented, suggesting that the attackers had comprehensive knowledge of American cybersecurity protocols. Communication between different agencies was breaking down as each organization prioritized protecting its own systems over coordinating a unified defense. General Kruger's leadership style, which relied on rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, was proving disastrous in a crisis that required rapid adaptation and creative problem-solving. His subordinates were afraid to present information that contradicted his predetermined conclusions, creating an echo chamber that reinforced failed strategies while ignoring emerging threats. Captain Rodriguez, still traumatized from her previous humiliation, had identified patterns in the attack signatures that suggested Russian state involvement, but she was too intimidated to present findings that might be seen as challenging the general's assessment. Other analysts who recognized problems with the current response remained silent, unwilling to risk their careers by contradicting established authority. Elena watched the disaster unfold with the cold clarity of someone who had seen it coming. Her analysis had predicted not just the secondary attacks, but the failure of conventional responses to address them effectively. She understood that the attackers had studied American decision-making processes as carefully as they had studied technical vulnerabilities, designing their assault to exploit organizational weaknesses as much as technological ones. The most frustrating aspect was seeing how easily the crisis could have been contained if her analysis had been taken seriously. The attacking organization's methodology was sophisticated, but not invisible to someone who understood their operational patterns. Their command and control infrastructure had vulnerabilities that could be exploited, but only if the defenders understood what they were actually fighting. Instead, American intelligence agencies were responding to phantom threats while missing the real ones. They were reinforcing systems that weren't actually under attack while leaving critical vulnerabilities unprotected. The attackers were staying several moves ahead because they understood their opponents better than the opponents understood themselves. As evening approached, Elena realized that the situation was about to become much worse. Her analysis suggested that the next phase would involve simultaneous attacks on transportation networks and emergency services, time to maximize chaos during the morning commute. Millions of civilians would be trapped in darkened cities with no power, no communication, and no way to access basic services. At 6:30 in the evening, as the crisis entered its 8th hour with no signs of resolution, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She had spent the day watching American infrastructure crumble while the people responsible for protecting it fumbled with inadequate responses. Her analysis showed that the next wave of attacks would begin in less than 6 hours, targeting transportation and emergency services during the morning commute. Millions of lives were at stake, and the official response was not just failing, it was making the situation worse. She gathered her comprehensive analysis, printed on 17 pages of dense technical documentation that outlined not just what was happening, but why conventional responses were failing, and what needed to be done to stop the assault. Her unofficial intelligence network had provided her with information that wasn't available through normal channels, including technical specifications of the malware, communication intercepts from the attacking organization, and analysis of their command structure. Most importantly, she had identified a vulnerability in the attacker's coordination system that could be exploited to disrupt their entire operation. The assault required precise timing and constant communication between different cells, but their command and control infrastructure had a single point of failure that could be targeted with the right approach. She had even identified the physical location of their primary coordination center, hidden within a seemingly legitimate technology company in Prague. Elena walked to the crisis briefing room, where General Kruger was conducting another futile strategy session with his senior staff. Through the glass walls, she could see him gesturing aggressively at wall-mounted displays showing the continuing attacks. His face was red with frustration as each proposed solution proved inadequate. Dr. Anderson and Captain Davis sat at the conference table, looking increasingly desperate as they ran out of conventional options. She knocked on the door and waited for permission to enter. The conversation stopped as all eyes turned toward the junior analyst who had no business interrupting. A crisis briefing. General Kruger's expression shifted from annoyance to barely controlled anger as he recognized her presence as a challenge to his authority during the center's most critical moment. This was the moment Elena had been preparing for her entire adult life. 8 years of hiding, of accepting dismissal, of watching mediocrity triumph over competence, had led to this single opportunity to prove that the quiet woman in the corner had capabilities that exceeded everyone who had ignored her. "Sir," she said, her voice calm despite the tension in the room, "I have analysis that I believe is crucial to resolving this crisis." The confrontation that followed Elena's entrance into the briefing room was swift and decisive. Rather than examining her analysis or considering her sources, General Kruger focused entirely on what he perceived as a fundamental challenge to his authority. Within minutes of her presentation, she found herself the subject of an internal investigation that treated her intelligence gathering as potential treason rather than exceptional initiative. "You're telling me," Kruger said slowly, his voice dangerous, "that you've been conducting unauthorized intelligence operations while assigned to routine analysis duties? I'm telling you that I have information that can stop this attack before it destroys American infrastructure," Elena replied, maintaining her composure despite the hostility radiating from everyone in the room. The aftermath was brutal. Security personnel searched her desk while she watched, confiscating files, personal belongings, and equipment under the pretense of determining whether she had compromised classified information. Her computer access was revoked, her security badge was flagged for monitoring, and she was reassigned to a temporary workspace in an isolated corner of the building, where her activities could be closely observed. The investigation was led by Major Wilhelm Harper, Kruger's deputy and most loyal enforcer. Harper had built his career by identifying and neutralizing threats to his superior's authority, approaching the task with methodical precision. He viewed Elena's claims not as potentially valuable intelligence, but as evidence of dangerous independence that needed to be eliminated. "Specialist Martinez," Harper said during their first interview, "you've admitted to conducting unauthorized intelligence operations. These activities violate multiple regulations regarding information security and chain of command. We need to understand the extent of your unauthorized activities and determine whether security has been compromised." Elena sat across from him in a sterile interview room, understanding that she was being treated as a suspect rather than someone trying to help. "Major, I've provided analysis that could prevent a catastrophic attack on American infrastructure. Perhaps we should focus on stopping that threat rather than questioning my methods." "Your methods are the issue, Martinez. You claim to have sources that senior intelligence officers don't know about. You admit to gathering classified information outside official channels. Either you're lying about your capabilities, or you're operating an unauthorized intelligence network that represents a serious security breach." The investigation revealed the depth of Elena's unofficial activities in ways that were both impressive and damning. Harper's team discovered her extensive files on American security vulnerabilities, her detailed analysis of terrorist financing networks, and her communications with former special operations personnel across multiple agencies. What should have been evidence of exceptional dedication was instead treated as proof of suspicious behavior. Her colleagues began to distance themselves as word of the investigation spread throughout the center. People who had worked with her for years suddenly found reasons to avoid conversation, treating her as if her supposed security violations might be contagious. Captain Davis, who had previously praised her thoroughness, now questioned whether her excessive preparation had been motivated by inappropriate ambitions. Rebecca Thompson confronted her during a brief encounter in the cafeteria. "Elena, what were you thinking? People are saying you've been running some kind of private intelligence operation, that you've been gathering classified information without authorization." "I've been doing my job," Elena replied quietly. "I've been trying to identify threats before they materialize. Everything I did was motivated by protecting American security. But you went around proper channels. You didn't trust the system. The system failed, Rebecca. Look around. American infrastructure is under attack, and the official response has been completely inadequate. My analysis could have prevented this. That's not your decision to make. We have procedures for a reason." The conversation crystallized everything wrong with the institution Elena had served for 8 years. In their worldview, following procedures was more important than achieving results. Maintaining hierarchy mattered more than protecting lives. Being right was less valuable than being obedient. True to her predictions, the second wave of attacks had targeted transportation networks during the morning commute, stranding millions of commuters in darkened subway systems and bringing air traffic across the eastern seaboard to a complete halt. Emergency services struggled to respond as their communication systems failed systematically. But instead of reconsidering her analysis, the investigation intensified. Harper seemed determined to prove that her predictions had been based on illegally obtained information rather than superior analytical capabilities. He interviewed her contacts, examined her training records, and scrutinized her financial records, looking for evidence of foreign influence or criminal activity. "Your training background is unusual for an intelligence analyst," Harper noted during their second interview. "Extensive martial arts training, connections to former special operations personnel, combat psychology studies. These aren't typical qualifications for someone in your position." "They're qualifications that make me better at my job," Elena replied. "Understanding combat psychology helps me analyze terrorist motivations. My training contacts provide me with insights that aren't available through official channels, or they provide you with classified information that you're not authorized to access. The most damaging aspect of the investigation was how it poisoned her relationship with people who had previously respected her work. Her comprehensive knowledge was reframed as suspicious behavior. Her dedication was portrayed as obsessive ambition. Her successful predictions were treated as evidence that she had prior knowledge of the attacks rather than superior analytical capabilities. Dr. Anderson, whose career had been built partially on appropriating her insights, publicly distanced himself from her work. During briefings, he made pointed comments about the importance of working within established protocols and dangers of analysts who thought they knew better than their superiors. General Kruger used the investigation to reinforce his authority over the entire intelligence center. Elena's case became an object lesson about what happened to people who challenged established hierarchy, who thought they could operate outside proper channels, who believed their individual insights were more valuable than institutional wisdom. As American infrastructure continued to crumble and the official response continued to fail, Elena found herself completely isolated within the system she had tried to serve. Her warnings had been ignored, her analysis dismissed, and her character destroyed by people who value conformity over competence. But on the morning of March 18th, as the cyber attack entered its fourth day with no signs of resolution, Elena received a message that changed everything. The communication came through her unofficial network, an encrypted text from Master Sergeant Williams containing just 3 words. They found Prague. She knew immediately what he meant. Her analysis had identified the attacker's primary coordination center in Prague, hidden within the offices of Zenith Technologies, a legitimate software company that provided cover for a sophisticated cyber warfare operation. While American intelligence agencies continued to fumble with ineffective responses, someone had acted on her intelligence. The follow-up message provided details that both vindicated her analysis and revealed the magnitude of what she had discovered. A joint Czech-American Special Operations team had raided the Prague facility, finding exactly what her report had predicted: a fully operational command center coordinating the attacks against American infrastructure, staffed by Russian military intelligence personnel operating under commercial cover. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Computer servers contained detailed plans for the multi-phase assault on American systems, including the transportation and emergency services attacks that had occurred exactly as she had predicted. Financial records revealed funding from Russian state sources channeled through multiple shell companies. Most damning of all, intercepted communications showed that the attackers had been monitoring American response efforts in real time, adjusting their strategy based on the defenders' predictable reactions. But instead of vindicating her warnings, the Prague raid created new problems for Elena. General Kruger and Major Harper now had to explain how a junior analyst under investigation for unauthorized intelligence activities had somehow obtained information that senior Pentagon intelligence agencies had missed entirely. Her accuracy was more threatening than her alleged insubordination. The meeting, convened in Kruger's office, felt more like a tribunal than a briefing. Present were the General, Major Harper, Dr. Anderson, and Captain Davis, along with Colonel Sandra Reynolds from Pentagon Intelligence Command, who had flown in specifically to address the Prague situation. The atmosphere was tense with the unspoken recognition that Elena had been right about everything while the official intelligence apparatus had been catastrophically wrong. Specialist Martinez, Colonel Reynolds began, "We need to understand how you obtained intelligence about the Prague operation that wasn't available through official Pentagon channels." Elena understood that she was at a crossroads. She could continue to protect her sources and methods, accepting whatever consequences came from her refusal to cooperate with the investigation, or she could reveal everything, exposing the network. a former special operations personnel who had trusted her with information that the official system couldn't access. "Colonel, my analysis was based on pattern recognition and open-source intelligence, combined with insights from former military personnel who understood the operational methodologies involved." "That's not an answer," Harper interjected. "You provided specific technical details about malware characteristics, communication protocols, and physical locations. That level of detail requires access to classified information. Or it requires better analytical capabilities than anyone in this room possesses," Elena replied, her patience finally beginning to crack. General Kruger leaned forward, his voice carrying the menace that had intimidated subordinates for decades. "Martinez, you will explain exactly how you obtained this intelligence, or you will face charges for unauthorized access to classified information and potential espionage. I obtained it by being better at my job than anyone gave me credit for," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the threat. "I recognized patterns that senior analysts missed. I developed sources that official channels couldn't access. I predicted attacks that conventional thinking said were impossible. You had unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence assets," Kruger stated as fact rather than question. "I had contact with people who take American security seriously, enough to share information with someone who could analyze it effectively." The accusation hung in the air between them. Kruger was essentially charging her with treason based on her success at identifying threats that his official apparatus had missed. Her competence was being treated as evidence of criminal activity, because acknowledging her capabilities would require admitting the failure of everyone who had dismissed her. Colonel Reynolds studied the file in front of her, which Elena assumed contained the full details of the Prague raid and its implications. "Specialist Martinez, regardless of how you obtained this intelligence, the fact remains that you operated outside established protocols. Military discipline requires adherence to chain of command. Military discipline should also require protecting the people we're sworn to defend," Elena replied. "While you were investigating my methods, thousands of people were trapped in darkened cities because infrastructure attacks that I predicted weren't prevented." "That's not your decision to make," Harper said sharply. "Then whose decision is it? The people who didn't see the attacks coming? The people who couldn't develop effective responses? The people who are more concerned with protocol than results?" Elena realized that she had just crossed every line of military decorum and institutional hierarchy. She had openly challenged the competence of her superiors, questioned the value of established protocols, and essentially accused the leadership of prioritizing their own authority over public safety. General Kruger stood slowly, his face flushed with the rage of someone whose authority had been directly challenged in front of witnesses. For a moment, the room was completely silent except for the sound of his heavy breathing as he processed the magnitude of her insubordination. "Specialist Martinez," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you are hereby relieved of duty pending court-martial proceedings. Security will escort you from the building immediately." Elena had reached the point of no return. 8 years of preparation, of hiding her capabilities, of accepting limitations imposed by people who couldn't see past their own assumptions had led to this moment. She could accept dismissal and disgrace, or she could finally show them exactly who they had been underestimating. She stood to face General Kruger, her decision already made. The security escort never materialized. As General Kruger reached for his phone to call for military police, alarms began blaring throughout the building. Emergency lights flashed in the corridors as automated systems detected what Elena had been warning about for days. The third wave of attacks had begun, targeting the defense infrastructure itself. Through the office windows, she could see smoke rising from the main power substation that supplied the intelligence center. Communication arrays on the building's roof sparked and went dark as targeted electromagnetic pulses disabled their functionality. Most critically, the secure computer networks that connected American intelligence agencies began failing systematically, cutting off coordination between Pentagon command centers at the moment when cooperation was most crucial. The attackers had studied American response patterns during the previous attacks and had concluded that the defense infrastructure needed to be neutralized to prevent any effective countermeasures. They were implementing the final phase of their operation, blinding and isolating the intelligence apparatus while preparing for coordinated strikes against government facilities across multiple regions. Elena watched the chaos unfold with the cold clarity of someone who had seen it coming. Her analysis had predicted not just the timing of this phase, but its specific methodology. The attackers were using inside knowledge of American security protocols to target vulnerabilities that official assessments had never identified. They weren't just attacking systems. They were attacking the assumptions that those systems were built on. General Kruger stood frozen as reports flooded in about cascading failures across American defense networks. His face cycled through confusion, denial, and finally the terrified recognition that his command center was under direct assault by enemies who understood his capabilities better than he understood theirs. "Sir," Captain Davis said, his voice shaken as he read updates from his compromised terminal. "We're receiving reports of simultaneous attacks on Pentagon facilities in Virginia, Colorado, and Nebraska. Primary communication links are down. We're losing contact with allied commands." The magnitude of the disaster was becoming clear. American intelligence and defense coordination was collapsing in real time, leaving individual agencies isolated and vulnerable to whatever came next. The attackers had systematically dismantled the collective security apparatus that protected over 300 million people. But Elena also understood something that the others didn't. The attack wasn't complete yet. The intelligence she had gathered suggested that the systematic destruction of defense infrastructure was preparation for a final phase that would target civilian government facilities and emergency services. The goal wasn't just disruption, it was the complete collapse of American governmental authority. "Colonel Reynolds," she said, her voice cutting through the panic in the room, "the attack isn't finished. They're preparing to target civilian government facilities next. The Capitol, state governments, emergency services coordination centers. This is preparation for something much worse." Kruger turned toward her, his authority completely shattered by events that had exceeded his worst-case scenarios. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I actually understand what we're fighting," she replied. "While you were investigating me, I was tracking their operation. I know their methodology, their timing, their next targets." "What are you proposing?" Colonel Reynolds asked, desperation overriding military protocol. Elena made her choice. For 8 years she had worked within a system that valued hierarchy over competence, protocol over results. She had hidden her capabilities, accepted limitations, and watched mediocre leaders make decisions that endangered the people she had sworn to protect. Now that system was collapsing, and the only way to save it was to operate completely outside. "It gave me access to the emergency communication system," she said. "I can coordinate a response through my unofficial network that doesn't depend on compromised Pentagon channels." "Absolutely not," Harper interjected. "You're under investigation. You don't have authorization for that level of access." "Major," Elena said quietly, "look around. Your authorization protocols are melting down along with everything else. You can either let me try to stop this, or you can maintain your chain of command while American civilization collapses." The emergency lighting flickered as another power station was compromised. Through the windows, she could see military vehicles racing across the compound as commanders tried to coordinate responses, using methods that hadn't been necessary since the Second World War. "This is insane," Dr. Anderson protested. "She's a junior analyst with no command authority." "I'm someone who saw this coming while all of you were playing politics," Elena replied. "I'm someone who has the contacts and analysis needed to stop this before it gets worse." General Kruger faced the defining moment of his career. He could maintain his authority and watch American security collapse under his command. Or he could trust a subordinate who had been right about everything while he had been wrong about everything. But as he hesitated, Elena realized that waiting for permission was another form of accepting limitations. She had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this moment, developing capabilities that exceeded anything in the official system. The time for hiding was over. She walked toward the emergency communication console, knowing that whatever happened next would either save American infrastructure or end her career permanently. As her hand reached for the activation controls, she heard General Kruger shout behind her, "Martinez, stop! That's a direct order." Elena paused and looked back at him, seeing not the intimidating authority figure who had terrorized subordinates for decades, but a frightened man whose world was collapsing around him. "Sir," she said calmly, "with respect, your orders haven't been working very well." She activated the system and began reaching out to her network. Within minutes, Elena had established communication with contacts that spanned across America's intelligence and special operations communities. Her unofficial connections, built over 8 years of careful relationship building, became the backbone of a coordinated response that operated completely parallel to the failing Pentagon command. Structured. As Elena worked, she could feel the eyes of the Pentagon officers watching her with a mixture of amazement and horror. She was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything they had imagined possible, coordinating a response that their official apparatus couldn't match. But she was also operating completely outside their authority, proving that their entire institutional framework was not just inadequate, but actively harmful to American security. "This is incredible," Colonel Reynolds whispered, watching as Elena's network began reporting successes that the official response had been unable to achieve. "How did you build this network?" "By recognizing that institutional politics matter less than operational effectiveness," Elena replied without looking up from her communications. "These people trust me because I've been right when official channels have been wrong." Her coordination revealed the true scope of the attack and the stunning effectiveness of her countermeasures. The attacking organization had indeed planned a final assault on civilian government facilities, but Elena's network was systematically dismantling their operational capability before they could execute the plan. But as her success became undeniable, General Kruger's humiliation deepened into something more dangerous. He had built his career on the premise that authority derived from position rather than competence, and Elena's unauthorized operation was destroying the foundation of everything he believed about military hierarchy and institutional control. "Martinez," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "you will shut down this unauthorized operation immediately. You're conducting military operations without authorization, violating chain of command, and compromising Pentagon security protocols." Elena continued working, her fingers moving across multiple communication interfaces as she coordinated responses across a dozen agencies. "Sir, my unauthorized operation has prevented attacks on the Capitol, the Supreme Court, and the Federal Reserve. Perhaps you should focus on results rather than protocols. I'm ordering you to stop, and I'm declining to follow that order." She replied calmly, "Your orders led to the near collapse of American security infrastructure. My judgment has been consistently superior to yours throughout this crisis." The confrontation was witnessed by Colonel Reynolds, Major Harper, Dr. Anderson, and Captain Davis, all of whom understood that they were seeing the complete breakdown of military discipline and institutional authority. Elena had openly refused a direct order from a general officer, had assumed command authority she didn't possess, and was conducting military operations that exceeded anything in her official capacity. But they were also seeing those unauthorized operations succeed where every official response had failed. American infrastructure was stabilizing for the first time in 4 days. Communication between federal agencies was being restored through channels that the attackers couldn't compromise. The systematic assault that had brought American civilization to the brink of collapse was being systematically dismantled by a network that operated outside all established protocols. General Kruger faced the ultimate challenge to his worldview. He could acknowledge that a subordinate had been right while he had been catastrophically wrong, or he could use his physical authority to reassert control over a situation that had exceeded his intellectual capabilities. Elena sensed a shift in his mood before anyone else in the room recognized the danger. Her combat training, dormant for 8 years of careful concealment, began to surface as she identified the tells that indicated Kruger was transitioning from institutional intimidation to physical violence. His breathing pattern changed, becoming deeper and more deliberate. His posture shifted as he unconsciously prepared for physical action. His hands clenched and unclenched as he struggled between his trained military discipline and his desperate need to reassert dominance over someone who had exposed his fundamental inadequacy. "Sir," Colonel Reynolds said carefully, sensing the dangerous tension building in the room, "perhaps we should focus on coordinating with Martinez's network rather than debating authorization." But Kruger was beyond rational calculation. The success of Elena's unauthorized operation had shattered his sense of reality, forcing him to confront the possibility that everything he believed about leadership, authority, and military competence was fundamentally wrong. Elena completed her final coordination message and turned to face him directly, knowing that the moment she had been preparing for her entire adult life was about to arrive. The transformation in General Kruger was complete. 8 years of dismissing Elena as insignificant, 4 days of having his leadership exposed as inadequate, and now the final humiliation of watching her succeed where he had failed catastrophically had pushed him beyond the boundaries of military discipline and rational thought. "You think you can embarrass me in front of Pentagon Command?" he snarled, stepping toward her with the predatory movement of someone who had decided that physical intimidation was his last remaining tool. "You think some junior analyst can make me look incompetent?" Elena remained perfectly still, her body appearing relaxed while her mind cataloged every detail of his approach. His size advantage was significant. He outweighed her by more than 100 pounds and had 6 inches of reach. But she had spent 8 years studying opponents exactly like him, men who relied on size and aggression, because they had never learned to fight against someone who couldn't be intimidated. "Sir," she said quietly, "you've made yourself look incompetent." "I've just demonstrated what competence looks like." The words hit him like a physical blow. In front of witnesses who would report this confrontation throughout Pentagon Command, a junior analyst had openly declared him incompetent and proven it through operational success that exceeded anything he had achieved in 30 years of military service. Kruger's training told him to maintain discipline, to use institutional channels to destroy her career, to crush her through systematic application of military justice. But his ego demanded immediate physical vindication of his authority. The contradiction between his military discipline and his psychological need for dominance created a moment of hesitation that would define everything that followed. "General," Colonel Reynolds said, recognizing the danger and stepping forward, "perhaps we should stay back." Kruger snapped, his attention fixed entirely on Elena. "This insubordinate little girl needs to learn what happens when you challenge your superiors." Elena felt the familiar calm that had settled over her during countless training sessions with Master Sergeant Williams. Time seemed to slow as her combat psychology training took control, analyzing angles, distances, and potential responses with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. She could see the attack coming before Kruger had consciously decided to make it. His weight shifted slightly forward. His right shoulder dropped almost imperceptibly, and his breathing pattern changed in ways that telegraphed his intentions to someone trained to read such signals. "General," she said, her voice carrying the absolute calm of someone who was no longer hiding, "you really don't want to do this." But Kruger was beyond reason, beyond military discipline, beyond any consideration except his desperate need to physically dominate someone who had intellectually destroyed him. His career, his reputation, his entire sense of identity had been shattered by this small woman who had proven herself superior in every way that mattered. "I'm going to teach you some respect," he growled, raising his hand to strike her down in front of the assembled Pentagon officers. Elena watched his movement with the detached precision of a predator who had finally been given permission to hunt. For 8 years, she had hidden capabilities that exceeded anything in conventional military training. She had accepted limitations, endured dismissal, and allowed mediocrity to treat her as insignificant while she built skills that they couldn't imagine. But now, with General Kruger's hand descending toward her face and witnesses present to document what happened next, she finally had justification to show them exactly who they had been underestimating. The hand that had been raised to strike her never reached its target. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Elena moved with speed and precision that transformed her from a dismissed analyst into something that resembled a force of nature. Her response was not a desperate defensive action, but a calculated demonstration of capabilities that had been hidden beneath 8 years of careful camouflage. Kruger's attack, launched with the confidence of someone who had never faced real opposition, met a level of skilled violence that exceeded anything in his experience. The general who had built his career on intimidating subordinates discovered what happened when physical aggression encountered someone who had been trained by masters of combat. The confrontation lasted exactly 3 seconds. When it was over, General Heinrich Kruger lay unconscious on the floor of his own office. His 30-year military career effectively ended by someone he had never considered a threat. The witnesses stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just seen. Elena stood over him, breathing normally, her uniform barely disturbed, looking down at the man who had terrorized subordinates for decades and who now lay helpless at her feet. "Colonel Reynolds," she said calmly, "I believe you have a country to help save." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within hours, Elena Martinez had been placed in charge of coordinating the American response to the largest cyber attack in the nation's history. Her unofficial network, operating with full Pentagon authorization, systematically dismantled the remaining elements of the assault while identifying and neutralizing the state sponsors who had orchestrated it. General Kruger was quietly retired, his dismissal attributed to health concerns, rather than the embarrassing reality that he had been physically defeated by a subordinate 1/3 his size. The official investigation into Elena's unauthorized activities was quietly dropped, replaced by a comprehensive review of how such exceptional capabilities had been overlooked for 8 years. 6 months later, Elena Martinez was promoted to a Director of Strategic Threat Assessment, the youngest person ever to hold such a position. Her first act was to implement new protocols that valued analytical capability over institutional hierarchy, ensuring that future threats would be identified by the people best equipped to see them, rather than the people best positioned to take credit for them. Master Sergeant Williams attended her promotion ceremony, watching with quiet pride as his former student received recognition that was 8 years overdue. "You finally stopped hiding," he told her afterward. "I learned from the best," Elena replied. "You taught me that the most dangerous warrior is the one nobody sees coming. And now they've all seen you. Elena smiled, looking out over the intelligence center where brilliant minds were finally free to work without fear of retaliation for being right. Good. Now maybe we can actually protect the people we're supposed to serve. The quiet analyst who had spent 8 years being underestimated had become exactly what America's security apparatus needed. Someone who understood that real strength came not from position or authority, but from the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. In 3 seconds, she had ended one career and transformed her own. But more importantly, she had saved a system by refusing to be limited by it, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show the world exactly who really are. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.